Hello, my name is Tim Shoebridge. I'm very pleased to announce my latest user oscillator for this, the Korg Minilogue XD, as well as the Korg Prologue. And that user oscillator is called Fold. So what is Fold? Well, Fold is my most experimental user oscillator to date, and that's a little bit of a gamble for me because to me personally it's probably the least musical of the user oscillators that I've developed so far. That being said, you can get some really quite weird and wonderful sounds out of this user oscillator, so I think it's a worthwhile addition to the collection that I've put together so far. Now, where the idea came from was, well, from wave folding. I've got a piece of old Eurorack gear that is a wave folder. I was mucking around with it. This is going back a few months now because that's when I really sort of like started this project. I was mucking around with it, trying to figure out how it worked. And it was at that time that I thought, well, maybe it might be interesting to see if I could emulate what it does and put that emulation inside the Minilogue XD and the Prologue. Because wavefolding is very much the result of an analog circuitry behavior thing. It's not a mathematical model. So I've ended up having to emulate what the wavefolder does, and I must admit that I haven't done it very accurately, but I think that the user oscillator at least has the spirit of wavefolding inside it. Now there are two parameters, very important parameters, that you need to set in this user oscillator to get the wavefolding to work. And I think the best way for me to explain those two parameters to you is to show you graphically what they do. But after I've done that, I will then do some hands-on with the Minilogue XD, change those parameters so you can hear how they affect the sound. So that's what's coming up next, a little bit of theory, then a practical. I really do hope you enjoy this video. Thanks very, very much for watching. Right, there are two basic parameters that I've implemented inside this user oscillator to control the wave fold effect. The first one is called fold amount, and the second one is called fold frequency. I'll cover fold amount first. Now what we do is we start with a basic waveform, a sine wave. That's what I've implemented inside this user oscillator. Sine waves tend to work best with wave folding. Now what if we were to limit this waveform? Now limiting is a common practice for introducing distortion into a waveform. Digital clipping, for example, is just a way of limiting a waveform. Now if we were to limit this waveform by say 25%, it would look like this. We're basically cutting off the extremities of the waveform and replacing them with a flat line. So this is 25%, this is 50%, 75%, and then as we approach 100%, we're basically completely flatlining that waveform and reducing it to zero. Now what this user oscillator does is replace those flat line portions of the waveform with a secondary sine wave waveform, a fold waveform. So this is what it looks like at 25% limit. Now instead of calling it limit, I'm calling it fold amount, because it's not only controlling where the waveform is getting limited at, but it's also controlling the amplitude of this secondary sine wave waveform that I'm introducing. So this is 25%, this is 50%, this is 75%, and this is approaching 100%. Now going back to 50%, you can see here that we've got like an equal mix of the original waveform and this secondary fold waveform. So this is kind of where we get the maximum wave fold effect being heard. When we go past 50% fold amount, the secondary waveform is really taking over and becoming dominant. And by the time we get to 100%, the original waveform has been completely wiped out. We've just got this secondary waveform that we're hearing. So that is the fold amount parameter. The second parameter is called fold frequency. Now if we look here at the waveform where we have a fold amount of 50%, literally fold frequency is what it is. It is changing the frequency of that secondary waveform. Right, we're going to start off with an initialized patch. So we're going to turn down VCO1, turn up the multi-engine, switch to User Oscillator, and choose my fold oscillator. So by default we get a sine wave, or an approximation of a sine wave. And I'm just going to turn on a little bit of reverb, make it sound a bit nicer. There we go. So as I explained before, there are two basic parameters for this oscillator. There's a fold amount and a fold frequency. Now the frequency by default is controlled by the shape control, and the fold amount is the first parameter in the list. So without some sort of amount being set, we won't hear the effect. So I'm going to go into the parameters. First parameter is the amount, and I'll set it to sort of halfway, maybe 50%, so that we hear something. Come out the menu so that we can see the waveform. So now, by default, with the shape control at 0, what that means is that the frequency is going to be synchronized with whatever frequency you're playing. So we'll see our sine wave, our carrier wave, but it's going to be sort of limited top and bottom. Like that. So if I now start to add a little bit of shape, just a tiny amount, you'll see the change. As it starts to modulate. And it very quickly goes into audio rates. And then at 100% it sort of resynchronizes again with the keyboard frequency. So with just tiny amounts of the shape, we get these nice sort of undulations. And then as we go up into audio rates, we get a more FM kind of effect. And you'll find that there are these little sweet spots, say at 50%. There was one again at 33%, I think. Now there's an algorithm behind that frequency calculation, and as I was messing around creating this fold oscillator, I came up with a few variations of an algorithm, and I've left those variations inside the oscillator for you, and you can get at them through a parameter. It's the third parameter algorithm. So we're currently listening to number 1, but there are other ones, and they just respond differently to the shape control. Number 3 is quite a weird one. If I show you that one, go back down to 0 shape to start with. While we've got that strange sound, let's just mention the fact that the shape control is modulatable with the LFO. So let's have a go at that. I'll start off with a very slow rate and use a triangle. And we'll start off with it somewhere in the middle. And let's see what we get. Here we've got these two things going on. We've got the fold frequency doing its own weird and crazy thing, and we've got this constant sort of droning of the what I call the carrier wave, the sine wave. Now if we were to make the fold amount 100%, then our waveform would be completely the fold and none of the carrier, and then we'll just hear this weird stuff going on. So let me just do that. Let's go into the fold amount and whack it up to 100%. So now we're just hearing the fold frequency, the fold waveform on its own. weird and wonderful stuff there. Right, the next parameter I want to show you is called detune, because there are in fact two of these fold engines inside this user oscillator, and by default they're exactly the same. They're synchronized in terms of their frequencies, but you can detune them. So here I've got, what have I got? I've got the fold amount 50%, I've got algorithm number 2, and it sounds like this. Let's add some shape. And then add some detune. Right, so there's one more parameter to show you, and that is straight after amount. You actually see the legend there. It's actually amount/frequency, because when you're designing a user oscillator, it's always a tricky thing to decide which of the parameters should be the shape control, because it's the shape control that you can modulate using the LFO. And so I'm always thinking, well, which is the best parameter for modulation purposes? But when it comes to the fold amount and the fold frequency, I found that I couldn't really make up my mind which should be the shape control. So what I decided to do was allow you to choose which is the shape control. So you've got amount and frequency. By default, shape is the frequency and the parameter is the amount, but you can switch them around and make this the amount and the parameter the frequency. I know it's complicated, but it's there for you to be able to have a little bit more flexibility with this oscillator. So how you flip these parameters around is with the second parameter here called selector. It's just got two values, 1 and 2. 1 means frequency amount and 2 means amount frequency. So it's a way of flipping the frequency and the amount parameters around so that you can, for example, flip them around and then modulate the amount and leave the frequency alone as a parameter value in there. So in terms of the presets that I put together as I was developing this oscillator, which I'll provide for the Minilogue XD, some of those presets are modulating shape being the frequency, and some of them are modulating it being the amount. You get different effects. So I'll show you now a little example of modulating the shape as an amount. Okay, so what I've got here is I've got a frequency of 50%, and this is frequency because the next parameter is selector equal 2. So this is now the frequency, halfway, 50%. I'm choosing algorithm number 3, and I've got a little bit of detune going on. That's all I've got there. So the shape control is the fold amount, and it's at 0. But let's start to introduce it. And let's modulate that. Maybe we will modulate it going from something like 50% down to 0. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to use the LFO in one-shot mode. I'm going to use the sawtooth wave, which starts off high, drops down like a decay. Modulate the shape. I don't know what values to set yet. Let's just play it by ear, I suppose. It's a bit quick, but let's slow it down. Let's apply an envelope to the amplitude as well, so that we can just hear that